All right. Well, the long-awaited moment is here. Adam is back to talk history with me. We are both rank amateur historians who are doing something more akin to the universal history that Richard Rowland does with Jonathan Peugeot, and just sort of reframing the historical context. And we have what will hopefully round things out, which is Otto von Bismarck. So just when you thought the villain of the universe was Napoleon, it turns out he just sets the stage for the perfection of his fundamental misunderstanding of the universe, which manifests in this myth of Germany, which we will get into. So, Adam, welcome back. What would you like to say about our buddy Otto von Bismarck?
Well, thank you. It's been a while since our last video, so it's been a busy time. But yeah, Otto von Bismarck. Let's get back into it. Probably one of the more important videos that we've done, if I can jump the gun there, because it does round off a lot of what we've kind of been talking about. So yeah, I mean, Otto von Bismarck is kind of underappreciated, or rather not really thought about nearly as much as most modern historians might kind of give him credit for. He's kind of wedged between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, and that's a period that's known specifically for sort of peacetime, general peacetime in the wider world of Europe. Although, in fact, there wasn't actually a lot of peace. There was a lot of internal strife. So, Otto von Bismarck.
That's more the historical reporting, and I think, when you're missing a through line when you don't take into account Bismarck, because he's the stopping off point to perfect the Great War, and actually gives the impetus for the Great War. And the reason why we skip from Napoleon to World War II is the myth of World War II. So this is going to elucidate for many viewers and listeners the whole myth of World War II problem and where it comes from. But please continue.
Sure. So the best thing to kind of frame Bismarck is to give an idea of the time he's growing up in, because that influences what happens later on in his life, and partially, I'd say, consciously so. So Bismarck is born in a time, is a young man at the time where you have a lot of these major revolutions happening. He's born pretty much at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And so he doesn't really have much in the way of memory of the Napoleonic Wars necessarily right in front of his face. And he's a noble. He's part of the Prussian Junker class, which is basically small landowners in the east of modern day Germany, actually the Far East, actually probably modern day Poland is where he's situated, and which is obviously old Prussia. And he gets a sort of, pretty standard education for people in that region, in the region of what was formerly the Holy Roman Empire plus Prussia, because part of Prussia used to be in the Holy Roman Empire and part used to be out. And that's significant because Prussia basically is a successor state to the Teutonic Order, going all the way back to the 1500s. Well, it's earlier than that, but it becomes a kind of political power in its own right around the 1500s during the Protestant Reformation. So the Teutonic Order basically transforms into Prussia. So nothing is really remarkable about, I would say, the childhood necessarily of Bismarck, other than the kind of circumstances of his childhood. He's growing up on a farming estate. He's being educated much in the way that somebody of his class would be educated. And I guess one thing that ends up becoming significant later in his life, or rather becomes a bigger influence later in his life, is his Lutheran faith, his pietism, although it doesn't necessarily show nearly as much in his youth, because he goes off to college, basically. So we'll skip basically his childhood, because you can say stuff about it, but realistically, like, he becomes a historical figure really in his later teens and early adulthood, where he goes off to university. shouldn't say college, university, goes to one of the German universities. And something that's significant in the German universities at this time, around the 1830s and 40s, is the culture within a lot of them. Now, I'm jumping the gun by calling them German universities. They're the universities of the Holy Roman Empire. But I'm using it as a shorthand, basically, to give you kind of the region. So he would have been in kind of modern day Poland, but he would have migrated closer to the middle of basically the Holy Roman Empire at the time, and then what would later become modern Germany. So he would have went to universities like the sort of universities I'm talking about is like Magdeburg, Cologne, all of these kind of continental universities that are large and quite historied, and would be connected to figures like Goethe and Hegel and stuff like that. So these and Bismarck is coming at a time which is not too far removed from them in time. He's not contemporary, but he's a couple generations removed. But he's
in the universities, and the important thing is, for the most part, the only people who went to universities were in the upper class, right? They're not. Yes. Some of them are merchant wealthy. That's not technically upper class, although that was one path to the upper class for some people. But most of them were born into these families, these noble families, that are all influencing one another, right? So, if you're related to the royalty in France, the odds that you're related to the royalty in Germany and England are pretty high, right? And so, because the nobles are one group that goes across what we would call country boundaries, and thinking about that is very hard for us. We're thinking within country boundaries, but the nobility, the class systems did not go across country boundaries, right? On the lower end, it's not that poor people were breeding from poor people from different geographical areas because they couldn't move, but they're the same, because that's what class does. Class doesn't change based on which country you're in, except in, we'll call it implementation, right? And so the types of things you do, the sorts of foods you eat when you're wealthy, right? But it's all still like food that costs way more money than anybody else has, right? And so that's the mindset change that I think people might be missing, to sort of understand, this guy is born into the class that is supposed to breed the type of person, doesn't do it reliably and consistently, of course, like Goethe or unfortunately Hegel or Napoleon. He's also his father was a diplomat, right? So these sorts of people, the type of people that have an outsized impact on the world, are not coming from the bottom class. They're coming from the noble class. So I wanted to make that a little bit more clear. And so you're right to sort of talk about, it doesn't really matter which university and which geographical location it is, because they all really, almost without exception, have the same class of person in them, because they're expensive. But more importantly, they were designed that way. It's not like you couldn't necessarily buy yourself in. You needed a patron. The patronage system was still huge, right? You needed a patronage to get into an upper class job or a job above your station. You needed a letter of recommendation. You weren't going to do that by yourself on your own by distinguishing yourself. That was just not a thing until extremely recently. So I just want people to sort of get a picture of that. But please continue. So he's in the just after Goethe, basically, right? A definite great man, and he's in that milieu, in those sorts of circles.
Yeah, and it's worth also noting as well that he moves to the university town. So the people's conception of university obviously now is different from when it was then. And you're right, 100% that you need that patronage system, and it's only nobility. It's only basically people who can not only afford the education, but also the type of education that they would have undergone would have been effectively to form them into leaders, and into kind of that sort of role, basically. And Bismarck in particular, and it's also worth noting as well, as a kind of cultural note, is that in all of these universities at the time, again, the ones in the kind of former Holy Roman Empire, there were these clubs, there were these university clubs, and dueling was a very big thing at the time. Of course, it was in the wider society, but it showed itself in the universities in particular. So Bismarck was a member of one of these fraternities, effectively. And as a side note, those fraternities continued until, Germany, until the formation of Germany, and passed into the Second World War. And many of the men of the kind of German Reich, let's say the Third Reich or whatever, many of the commanders were men who had been part of these clubs, because and there were specifically dueling clubs. So a lot of them would actually have scars to prove that they were part of those. Later on, they became prestigious clubs. But so there is actually a through line as well later on that's worth noting there. But at the time, in the universities, there was this great interest in what would later be dubbed German nationalism. And in 1848, which we might have covered, I think, at some point, you had basically a sort of springtime of revolutions. Effectively, the waves of the French Revolution rippled through Europe in those intellectual spheres. And so there was a great interest in the former Holy Roman Empire, which at this point was called the German Union, or the Deutsches Bund, which consisted of most of the former members, and Austria, and the two kind of main powers post-Napoleonic wars were, in terms of military and cultural and economic power, were Prussia in the north and Austria, which was the domain of the Habsburg dynasty, who were the last Holy Roman emperors. And that's significant later on, but it's just to set the scene. During this springtime of revolution in 1848, which was the same year that the Communist Manifesto was published, there was a meeting of what would later be called, or what was called at the time, basically like a German parliament, a Reichstag is what it was called. And they flew the flag of modern day Germany, but the flag shows itself now, the tricolor, the black, red and yellow. And basically they wanted to instantiate this idea of a Germany, of united Germany, of basically uniting all the peoples who speak, well, German isn't the right way to put it, but basically to unite all the peoples within the former Holy Roman Empire, but particularly those who spoke a Germanic language. So, for instance, even though the Czechs were part of the Holy Roman Empire, a lot of the impetus behind this was kind of ethnic Germans, in the way that, and this probably follows on from the Napoleonic era, where you have this spreading out of basically like this creation of nation states, of what would later be called kind of nationalism. And so this Reichstag meets, and it's voting, and it's all representatives from these universities, right? All these university clubs, basically. And, philosophers and et cetera, right? And they vote, they assign all these kind of like articles and so on. But eventually the main thrust of it is that eventually they wanted a king, and they wanted to elect a king. And they offered the crown basically in their sort of temporary parliament to the Prussian king. And the Prussian king at the time refuses. He says, "I won't take a crown when it's offered to me from the gutter. I'll earn it myself." Yes, yeah. So Bismarck is growing up during this time period, and particularly at this point, he is returned from university and is basically living out of the life of a farmer. But he's been in those spheres. He's heard a lot of these people speak. And 1848 is also significant, not just because of these kind of genteel parliaments effectively being formed, and associations of kind of the upper class, but it's also there's rioting among the lower classes for basically it revolves around many things, but you can imagine some of it would be revolving around labor, and it's sort of what Marx was writing about, although it's not all that. And basically there's even in Berlin a riot to sort of overthrow the king and effectively replicate what had happened to some degree in France, because of course they beheaded the king. At this point, of course, the king had been returned, but France had never been fully stable. There was a lot of turmoil happening in the French state, basically to try and arrest what ended up being the French Revolution from firing up again. So there was actually an attack on Berlin, and the Prussian king rallied his, the troops were trying to rally to the capital basically to defend the king. And it's at this point that Bismarck, who is part of the nobility, and this is kind of indicative of his character, because there is a degree of impulsiveness in what he does, especially at this early age, in his early 20s. He rallies the peasantry, and he basically makes a levy, a peasant levy. He says, we're going to go, and he takes your pitchforks and everything, and he marches from where he lives in the kind of hinterlands to Berlin to basically rally troops for the king. And this was sort of a stunt, but it was a stunt that sort of got him noticed. Once he arrived with his men, he was kind of shooed away and said, "We don't need you here. It's fine. No, it's no big deal." But it showed that at the time that he was willing to take kind of almost silly action, but it was exemplary, because he was stepping forward at a time when a lot of the ministers of state were kind of taking a step back in anticipation of effectively a riot overthrowing the king. And this later on basically gave him an in with the king at the time, the Prussian king. So, at the time, across Europe, basically something similar like to this was happening, and most of the time it didn't get anywhere. In fact, it was all suppressed effectively. Right. In fact, at the time, the Russian Tsar ended up having to march through Europe to make sure that everything was. We took an army and marched through, to Vienna and Berlin and other places, to make sure that basically everything was under control. So that's kind of the framing for Bismarck's early life. But that's what gets him an in with the king, and eventually in the parliament of the Deutsches Bund, of the German Union, which is this kind of holdover of the Holy Roman Empire, which is not exactly the same as what basically was looking to instantiate a king. That was a kind of parallel institution that then kind of collapsed. But that is what gave Bismarck the in, and then eventually he was appointed as one of Prussia's representatives to the German Union, the successor to the Holy Roman Empire, the putative successor to the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah, the Federation, the German Federation, yeah.
The German Federation. Right. And so yeah, there what he's doing effectively is he's showing leadership and loyalty simultaneously. Right?
Yes.
And I think a lot of people get confused about leadership. Like, leaders have to be loyal to something or someone, preferably both, but something will do, or someone will do. But both would be better, and hopefully they're in alignment, because that just bolsters the case, we'll say. And that I can see why that would give you a lot of street cred, and your ability to control the rabble, because effectively he's taking the rabble to control the rabble at some level, right? Obviously that's a plus. Oh, he can rally these rabble towards the good, at least from the king's perspective. We can. People can be wrong and argue that's not the good, but they'll be wrong, and I don't care about them. So yeah, I mean I think that's important to understand. And then you sort of have to put what's going on into a larger context. And I think I've already told you some of this, but I'm just gonna lay out the grand pattern here as I see it. And that's not to say that I'm right, but also you're gonna have to come with some real goods if you want to knock this idea down, because I think it's pretty solid. So what seems to me to happen is you've got all of these orders we'll say the primary or most important among them is the Knights Templar. And I'm a huge fan of the Knights Templar. I've had my eye on them for a long time. They're going to go places. And a lot of people will know them from all sorts of, Dan Brown's work, or Oak Island, right? Curse of Oak Island TV show, or the earlier ongoing. That was a big, Oak Island was a big thing in the past, right? Because everybody's talking about, unsolved mysteries or whatever. They'd always talk about Oak Island. That was one at the top of the list. Until Ancient Aliens came along and ruined the world for us. But you also have the Knights Teutonic, and they're up there in this area, and they're, fighting the good fight and trying to convert the heathens and all that. And they're a militant order, much like the Knights Templar. Like they're supposed to keep the peace through force. This is the way Christendom operates and has to operate. And if you don't believe that, I'll just throw history books at you until you realize that's the only way it ever worked. It didn't work any other way. That's why knights exist. That's why knights and chivalry go together, because you have to have the strength mediated by the Christian virtues and values, if you want to frame it in so lame a fashion. I think most people will understand that. I don't want to get super precise. But what happens is the Knights Templar get betrayed by both a government, King Philip, the second, third, I forget, and the Pope at the same time. And this is a catastrophe, obviously. And it looks to me like the Teutonic Order freaks out and says, oh, we don't want that happening to us. We're going to have to build a state to protect us. Because if we had a state to protect us, even if the Pope goes insane, it's okay. And if it's our state, by the way, we can just ignore the Pope. But also, we're not going to betray ourselves, obviously. Duh. So it looks historically like they go on a mission to build a kingdom. In fact, a kingdom, not that they want to be part of the Holy Roman Empire. They're fine with that. Like, that's fine. But they want kingship, which the Templars never had, basically, right? It's the King of France that's betraying them. And so they're over by Latvia, right? Like they're nowhere near what we would call Germany. And then they slowly move west. It's kind of in little tiny pieces. And they try to become like a duchy of Poland, which is the big power, right? And then they actually kind of form a state. They kind of they use a loophole to get their duchyship, and they're kind of a duchy, but there is a Prussian king, and it's this weird, right? So this is sort of the beginning at some level of building out states randomly. And then to your initial point of this nationalism thing, nationalism has a very solid, complete, correct definition, right? Because nationalism is linked more to genetics and culture than it is to maps and governments, right? Or governance, if you want to be totally correct about it. And so when you say, we want to build a nation, that doesn't make any sense. You can't build a nation. I know why people are confused. That's our fault. Go USA. And Colin Woodard, well, I know you finally got the book. Colin Woodard does a nice job of proving this. The proof is in Colin Woodard's American Nations. There's all the proof you need. Like, he just outlines it. We're just misnaming our place as a nation. It's a federation of nations. And once you understand that, like, a bunch of things make sense. But no one understood that back then. They just see the success of the, quote, American nation, which isn't a nation. And they go, well, we want to do that too. They built a nation. Why can't we? Well, fair enough. If you could build a nation, but you can't. The definition of nation is really specific. The Irish in particular know this. That's why if you read their declaration, I think that was 1919, and I did get a chance to read several copies because it's kind of everywhere. It's everywhere in Ireland. They're like, we're proud of this.
It's on T-shirts.
Yeah, but they're appealing to the ancient definition of nation. right? They're like, no, something's changed. We don't like this new nation thing. We want to go back to the old way. We're all the, we're the people, the cultures, the race from this island. This isn't that, like, it's really easy in the case of Ireland. Like there's a people that were here that continued. They have a culture and they have a genetic a disposition that is unique to them. I don't know if you've ever seen the Irish people, Adam, but they all look the same pretty much. Like, you could tell the Irish in Boston. It was pretty easy. They're the super white guys. It's like, oh yeah, it's got to be an Irish guy. So
Yeah, they get burned in the sun.
Some of them get burned in the sun. Some of them do not, but most of them, yeah, pretty much. They're either red or white. They only come in two colors, depending upon whether or not it's summer or winter. So yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand the changes that are going on, with the French Revolution and this idea that you can just get rid of the king and replace it with nothing, or replace it with some systemic style of government that is precisely prescribed, right? The way Napoleon did, right? This is where the metric system and all this nonsense that doesn't work comes into being, is Napoleon's idea of precision. And look, it seems to work for a little while anyway, but it doesn't matter. They're still looking over and seeing the United States and going, see, they did it, which is a profound misunderstanding that persists to this day, I think. So within that, you can see why this might be the pivotal figure, which I think is part of the case that we're going to end up making here. So yeah, I just wanted to add that greater context and then get your comments.
Yeah. So, and the other thing to mention with the Templars is that the Pope at the time was stationed in, or was living in Avignon, which was a aberration for the time. So that it's and that's part of a whole other thing at the time. But and it makes sense to some degree when you're looking at that if you see the king and the Pope ganging up on another order, because they were both militant monastic orders, that you would take steps, and that time period where they had to take, they were trying to get kingship, that was, let's say you're thinking about, say, 1500 or something like that. From the Reformation onwards, the Teutonic Order basically turns Protestant eventually, and it's only until the early 1700s that they ever get the title of king in Prussia, which was their loophole of basically, getting the kingship rather than just being a duke.
Right.
But yeah, so and that's the sort of context of Prussia, which is very important for what's happening at Bismarck's time. And when we look at Bismarck, where he is in that federal parliament, effectively, he's the Prussian representative, and he again shows himself. He again kind of stands out from the crowd, because a weird thing at the time, and it's not like it was an ancient tradition necessarily, but it was effectively like a status compromise. In order to mark out the Austrian representatives as effectively having higher status in the parliament, the Austrian diplomats were allowed to smoke cigars in session, right? Nobody else was. It's a very strange sort of thing, but yeah. And one of the things that Bismarck does to effectively break this rule is he lights up his own cigar in the middle of the parliament, and the Austrian representatives kind of take umbrage with that. But he shows, and effectively what's being showed there is that he's trying to antagonize Austria. And why is he trying to do that? And insofar as he's concerned, it's because insofar as he is looking to aggrandize Prussia at the expense of Austria. And that vignette is a good example of effectively what he was looking to do. And it's worth noting at this point that initially, when Bismarck enters the political stage, the king of Prussia, I think there's a brief period where it's the one during the Napoleonic Wars, but the king in Prussia is Frederick William IV. So that this man ends up being he's the father of the Wilhelm the First that we know later on. But he actually initially doesn't like Bismarck, but because nobody else is there, Bismarck basically, and Bismarck is one of the few men who actually shows up to his aid. He uses him and puts him in a sort of, but basically as a cubbyhole. Like, his position in the federal parliament isn't a real sort of political appointment. But eventually, Bismarck gets on well with one of his sons, Wilhelm I, who, incidentally, he's an older man. He fought at Waterloo. Yeah, so he was a very young man. He might have been 19, but he had the command of a regiment in Waterloo. And he's a very militaristic young man. And yeah, so that's an essential piece of context, because Bismarck and him have effectively established a relationship to one another, and it's a good one, effectively, for Bismarck, because what ends up happening is basically Bismarck has a high degree of influence over Wilhelm I. He's not Wilhelm I just yet, but eventually, once he does become Wilhelm I, that's when Bismarck takes the next step into his, being basically a minister of state. And this is where you start to see him. You start to see basically his famous kind of acts from then on out. So one of the things that ends up happening around the late 1840s, early 1850s, is there's a dispute with the new borders of the German Federation in the north, because the old Holy Roman Empire there were these duchies, Schleswig and Holstein, and the Danish king was also the Duke of Schleswig and Holstein. I can't remember which one in particular was, but basically he held some of that territory. But because it was in the Federation, there was a kind of a dispute, because, of course, Denmark itself was not in the Federation. And in the sweep of German nationalism, there was a great kind of uproar to try and basically wrest the Duchy of Schleswig and Holstein from the Danish king and bring them in fully to the German Federation. And the question, of course, of who would gain those territories was ultimately, a question that would be decided between whether Prussia or Austria got it. But there were two wars fought over that. And surprisingly, the first one, the German Federation, the German federal states, including Prussia and Austria, lost. And that was because of the intervention diplomatically of Great Britain. But that was a kind of abortive attempt. Not really, there wasn't a great degree of effort put in, and if there was by the Germans, I'm skipping the gun. I'm using anachronistically a term here, because of course Germany hasn't been formed and wouldn't be formed for another 40 years. But the German federal states, they didn't exactly put their all into it, and they weren't organized either. Yeah. More importantly. And this became a bugbear for Bismarck. One of the things that he started to try and do in the face of that, because of course he wasn't front and center in the Prussian state at that point, but later on, and this is in the 1860s, as Bismarck is getting on, and he forms a relationship as well during this time between two other men, which would be Helmut von Moltke, who is a military man, strictly a military man, commander, and also Albert Graf von Roon, who is more of a diplomatic, sort of diplomatically focused figure. And these are men of about his age, and they are wrapped up in the kind of idealism or sort of big ideas of the time. And they want to set about effectively reforming things internally in the Prussian state, but then also more broadly in Germany. And these men would effectively help Bismarck to achieve the sorts of ends that he was looking to achieve. And the first thing that Bismarck set about doing was to correct the loss of the Danish, I don't know how to say it, the German-Danish War it's hard to, it's called historically the Schleswig-Holstein War because that's of course the states it was over, but it's hard of course at the time to define who was in fact involved. In any case, Bismarck starts setting about changing infrastructure, reorganizing the army, and additional things to that with the help of these men that he knows. So he wants to basically modernize the Prussian army, which was already disciplined, but effectively needed to kind of get ahead of its neighbors to win wars in that way, because this is the time when weapons are changing. It's not just cannons anymore. Artillery is becoming more precise, but you're getting, you know, more sort of explosive shots. You're getting rifles actually that are being used rather than the smoothbore muskets that were used in the Napoleonic Wars. So there's a lot of change happening. Railroads as well. They're starting to be built properly across Germany in particular, or rather, Prussia. And Prussia, after the Napoleonic Wars, gained a lot of territory in and around the Rhineland. So there was pressure on the Prussians to effectively hold this, but there was a gap between the Prussian heartland, basically in and around Berlin, and then Königsberg, and then what was basically the Rhineland territories of Prussia that they managed to get in the peace deal after the Napoleonic Wars. So Bismarck effectively sets about reorganizing the state, rebuilding the Prussian state for modern warfare, for effectively implementing this war for the German Federation to basically get the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein in. There's also social reforms that he's doing at the time as well, which are significant, although they come in later when he has more influence over the German states, or the states within the German Federation. But to kind of cut a long story short, he's one of the first men to implement, social welfare as it's kind of modernly understood within Germany, or within the kind of German states, within Prussia firstly, but then later the German state. And we can get to that later, but that's just he has this sort of reforming instinct, but he also has an instinct to combat the forces that attacked the king way back when he was young. So he's trying to effectively politically outmaneuver these people, because at the time you basically had a couple of different sides, but the main sides, and this is from the French Revolutionary framing, you had left and right, and the left were basically people who wanted to level things and get rid of hierarchy and provide things for the poor. And well, really it's just a redistribution of wealth. The way they would frame it would be, provide things for the poor, but it'd be redistribution of wealth. And then on the right, you would basically have supporters of monarchy and aristocracy who wouldn't, and at this point as well, they're very, regardless of where you are in Europe, there's a great intransigence to any sort of reform. And so generally they are a force that does not want to move. And what Bismarck does is effectively work to aggrandize the king, but through effectively reform. So effectively to cut off the political left, so far as that, within that French Revolutionary framing at the time, cut them off and actually implement the reforms and take the steam out of their sails, effectively take the wind out of their sails. Mm-hmm. So this is something that he's trying to do in the background within Prussia, although it's not nearly as big of an issue within Prussia as it is within the Greater German Federation, on account of the fact that Napoleon used to own, or not rather own, but be allies with many of the German federal states, what would be the German federal states, for instance, Bavaria and the states of the south, like Baden-Württemberg. So then Bismarck is doing this in the background, and meanwhile he is effectively trying to aggrandize the Prussian state. And at this point as well, his friend is now the king. And his friend the king is not a very political figure. He's not very politically involved, and if he is politically involved, Wilhelm I is of the latter persuasion within the left-right divide that I described. He's completely intransigent, but it's only Bismarck who basically can effectively influence him to pass reform policy And what he ends up finding, of course, is that Bismarck is effective at not necessarily passing the policy, but crafting the policy to aggrandize support for the king, whether it be among the aristocracy or among people themselves. And particularly as well the army, because the army is a large portion of the Prussian state. And then once the 1860s kick off, this is when you get the real maneuvering on Bismarck's part to get rid of Austria as the main player within the German Federation. And the way he does it is via that Schleswig-Holstein war. So he causes it, he doesn't cause directly, but he reignites the issue for the German Federation. And the war happens and the German states win. And this was primarily seen as a win for the Prussian military because they were at the forefront of it. The Austrians were there too, but the Austrians had outdated military equipment, and they were still using, for instance, muzzle-loading muskets. They weren't using railway nearly as effectively, and of course, how could they if they didn't have rail? The Austrian territory is in the south of Germany, whereas modern day Germany, whereas the Prussian territory is generally located in the north. So the Prussians, through their infrastructure, basically could get to the front lines first and get men on the border. And suffice it to say that the Prussians win, and that's the first kind of real test of their new military that had been kind of reformed under Bismarck. And that was a good testing ground, effectively, for new tactics, for new ways of doing warfare at the time. And it was also a win, particularly for the Prussian state in the eyes of the other German federal states, because it showed that they were effective in combat, and they were effective in defending effectively the borders of the German Federation. At least that's how Bismarck wanted it to be seen, and that's how it ended up being seen.
Yeah. So is this the war where he basically modifies one word to cause insult and start?
No, this is actually beforehand. And
before that. Okay.
Yeah, so that's the Franco-Prussian War, and that happens in the 1870s. So there's a period of about 10 years between that. And the reason why that's significant is there is a change. There is an intermittent period where basically the Franco-Prussian War is the impetus that Bismarck needed to form the German state.
Right.
But there is an intermittent period where there's a new state formed in the wake of the Schleswig-Holstein War called the North German Confederation. And basically, that's the northern German federal states submitting themselves or being brought under the full kind of sovereignty of Prussia and the Prussian king to basically manage their own foreign policy, to go to war together and defend each other and so on. Even though nominally that's the purpose of the German Federation, this is basically like Bismarck showing through Prussia that he can effectively defend these small states. And so they submit to the Prussian king, maybe not directly in the sense of paying him homage, but in a confederation effectively at the time. And then on to the Franco-Prussian War. So once you have this confederation, this is when Bismarck starts to roll out some of his policies, but there's significant policy later on regarding church and taxation, which doesn't really come into full view until you have the German Empire, because that's when you include the southern German states, which are predominantly Catholic. So,
well, then just real quick, just for my edification here. So what's effectively happening is you have a power vacuum as the result of the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. Those little vassal states, I think is what they used to be called, have no allegiance to any king. They might have their own nobility, right? They all have a noble class. Noble class is everywhere. It doesn't have anything to do with geography, right? So they have a nobility, but they don't have a head. They don't have a king. And then through we'll call it the sheer force of military, which is the thing that Napoleon sort of invents after a fashion. I mean, you make arguments about Caesar and Rome all day long, but they're just not going to stick if you know enough of the history. Like the deeper you dig, the more you realize, oh no, these are fundamentally different. Aside from the time period and the way societies were structured, even without all that, they're fundamentally different modes, right? Because the Roman Empire is an empire. They rule by conquest, but then we stopped ruling by conquest, right? And we started ruling by kings drawing up agreements. And then it sounds to me too like this is the age of agreements, because it's a very successful agreement over across the pond, as the Brits would call it, that seems to work. It it has some precedence because it kind of worked for the Netherlands there. The Dutch tried it first. Of course, they failed, but ours lasted. And so you've got these confederations popping up all over the place, which, as Colin Woodard points out in his book, like it should be called a Confederation of Nations and not, right? It's not a confederation. That doesn't make any sense. It's Confederation of Nations. But what you have is Bismarck, again, is able to lead the rabble, the unheaded masses, to a victory through sheer military force, using not the precision of artillery, but the precision of supply, right? Which is actually super important later. I don't think we'll really cover it, but if you know any history about the Great War in particular, maybe the second act, you'll understand how important logistics ends up being. That's how you do blitzkrieg. But this is all coming not directly from Napoleon, although some of it is, but directly from Bismarck. Like that's the pattern people are copying. Bismarck copying Napoleon. Napoleon's, basically a trendsetter, right? In this whole thing, like he just decimates the whole Roman Empire and calls it all one thing, right? Which we've gone over. And so now you have these Confederate documents about who, right? Because that becomes important in the first act of the Great War, right? But this is all the setup for this quote modernity thing that people seem to put way too late. Modernity is like 1500s. Modernity is not 1800s. So yeah, all right. So continue from there if you would.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I will just say while we're at this point, it is worth noting as well what Bismarck is doing at this time is novel, because you need to think about the Napoleonic Wars as effectively naked war, right? There's very little in the way of diplomacy going on, and what diplomacy there is, it's basically one side and the other. There's Napoleon and his allies, and it's basically the rest of Europe. And Napoleon generally takes on his allies and forces them to submit to him through military force, effectively.
Right.
The one exception is Spain, and that's only an exception for a couple of years, and then he deposes the Spanish king and puts his brother on the throne. So that tells you all you need to know, right? And and the important part is for Bismarck, again, having grown up in the post-Napoleonic world, you'll probably have heard this term of the balance of powers and great powers, and this is all language that has its origin in the post-Napoleonic Conference of Vienna. Right, and this is architected by there are different players. There's Talleyrand, who's the negotiator for the French, and Metternich, and maybe we can spend some time on that either later or probably in another video, because it's too complex at this point to really kind of get into. It should suffice to say though that in the aftermath of the Congress of Vienna, the rule was, or the idea behind that order was, we need to maintain peace in Europe at all costs, because the Napoleonic Wars devastated a large portion of the European continent, right?
Right.
And in fact, the Napoleonic Wars would have ramifications for even places like Spain and stuff well into the 20th century, and for instance, the Spanish Civil War and other things as well, right? But So Bismarck is in this time where you can't just declare war. You can't just take the fight to another nation or another country, because there are effectively some sort of agreement among the great powers, among the major countries of Europe, that they will move to contain that immediately, lest another Napoleon, lest another sort of great continent-spanning empire, which just forces into submission every country it comes across, come about again. And I guess at this point it is worth stating with Bismarck, and the Franco-Prussian War will be a very good example of this. But we already see it in this Danish, this war with the Danish, in the Schleswig-Holstein War. Bismarck increases territory, annexes, if you want to even use that word, but he takes territory either for Prussia or for Austria. At this point, almost it doesn't really matter to him, because he's thinking ahead to something more like Germany. He's taken that, and he doesn't gain, like, all of Europe doesn't descend upon him, right? All of the rest of the European countries don't descend upon him. And whereas Napoleon used his artillery, as you said, Bismarck basically uses something like diplomacy, policy, these kind of what would later be kind of termed under the umbrella of political science, whatever you might want to call that. But like that doesn't really, in the way that it's talked about later on, it doesn't really exist until Bismarck starts to use these sorts of maneuvers. It's effectively the fine-tuning of, you could even say it's maybe even the creation of politics as such.
That's where I was going to go.
Because he starts to, well, we'll tweak policy here and we'll change something here, and what ends up, what you get the impression of is that he is the mastermind behind it, and he's like somehow calculated all these either possible outcomes or what this outcome might end up, resolving to. And he's in the driver's seat effectively. And while in some cases he did do that, in a lot of cases, as I will talk about in the Franco-Prussian War, and this is the best example of it, he uses the opportunities that come his way, and he uses effectively something like optionality, in that he uses a sort of like he keeps options on the board and he uses them, and that's his genius. And so with the Franco-Prussian War, let's talk old world dynastic politics, because that's actually how it gets started. But it involves two states which aren't without dynastic politics, but basically they're the new kids in the block. France, in the meanwhile, we've been talking, has gone through another revolution and a couple others in between, and is now ruled by, at the time of the close to the 1870s, Napoleon's nephew, who calls himself Napoleon III. So France is under his supervision in the Second French Empire. I think I can't remember what republic number they're on at that point. I think Republic number 2 was the one that was overthrown, or Republic number 3. Don't quote me on that. It's number 2 or number 3. They're currently on Republic number 5 for anyone who's counting in the present moment. And so it involves those two. It involves Napoleon III, and it will eventually involve basically all the North German Confederation states and the states of southern modern day Germany in the interim. I will say in the interim between the Schleswig-Holstein War and the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians and the Austrians go to war. And again, there's a lot of politicking, and there's a lot of, but really, I think it's more important to focus on the Franco-Prussian War. But long story short, the Prussians have such dominance in terms of logistics with the railroads, in terms of military and modern military hardware, in terms of their rifles, their modern rifles or muskets, but much of a muchness. They have basically the equivalent of a bolt-action rifle in the 1860s, and the Austrians are still arming their men with old style muskets, and they have modern artillery as well. They wipe the floor with the Austrians, and basically they show that they are the dominant power in the German Federation, as well as the North German Confederation. Now, back to the Franco-Prussian War and the lead up to it. There is dynastic politics in Spain, and basically Spain needs a king, because what happens is, women in Spain can't inherit, and so the question is who's going to step up and inherit the Spanish throne. And there are candidates from all over Europe, and one of the ones that is suggested is basically a relative of the current Prussian king, who happens to be Catholic, a Catholic branch of one of the Prussian king's relatives. And he's put forward, and the French don't like the fact that that's happening, and effectively they send and by the way, this Prussian king is already elected by the Spanish to be their king. He goes to even accept and stuff like that, but he's stopped by the French, and but he's it's not like he's captured or anything. He's just turned back basically. And there's a whole all while that's happening, all while this is happening in the background, the French diplomat, the French embassy in the Prussian state, goes to the Prussian king, and in reality, what happened, or in reality, in terms of the conversation they had, what was exchanged was the Prussian king was asked by the French ambassador to effectively halt the accession of his relative to the Spanish throne, and he said also, would you mind also just not pursuing it any further? And the Prussian king responds, well, no, we're not going to do that, but I'll consider what you had to say. And that's a rough Cliff's Notes version of it, a relatively polite encounter. Mm-hmm. However, this is also at a time when newspapers are widely read, and Bismarck gets a hold of the journalist who managed to, or the person who managed to write down that conversation, right? The kind of report of that conversation, because maybe they went off and talked in private, and then somebody asked them, well, what did you guys talk about? And Bismarck edits the words, changes the word basically such that the impression that people would get reading the newspaper is that the French diplomat went up to the Prussian king, demanded that the Prussian king recall his relative, and swear never, ever, ever to never, ever to think about putting any one of his relatives on the Spanish throne ever, ever, ever. Effectively, it was framed in a very rude manner, and the Prussian king's response was edited such that it would basically be combative. It would say, well, no, we're not going to do that, and how dare you insult me while I'm walking around my own country. And that, once it was read in the French newspapers, basically was it caught on so much. It was like a match that started a fire, such that Napoleon III and the French government was so insulted that they went to war. It was like a red sheet to a bull. And so immediately following that publication, it wasn't anything else. Like the cause for the war was the newspaper report. It wasn't external circumstances. And so the French start to mobilize. And so then, of course, Bismarck and his advisors and stuff start to mobilize the German, what would later be retrospectively the German army, but the German states' armies, who were in the North German Confederation. They have that kind of integration, so they've got more men at their command. And the Prussians, and also it's worth noting, on the French side, they felt insulted, and then on the German-speaking side, or the German languages speaking side, they also felt insulted. And so it wasn't just the Prussians with their North Germanic Confederation; it was all the southern German states, including the Catholic states of Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg that I described before. They go into the war as well. They beat the Germans beat the French, even though the French actually have superior military hardware. The French at this point have Gatling guns, but they don't use, but they haven't developed the sort of thought around how to use them. They weren't using them like machine guns; they were using them like cannons. Still, they also have a more modern rifle called it's the chassepot, which is basically just a more modern version of, but it's like a bolt action. Basically, it's roughly the same, but a newer model of what the Prussians have. And they still lose the war. And upon losing the war, they don't even really get into German territory. They don't even cross the Rhine. They get outflanked and outmaneuvered around around kind of the Luxembourg, Strasbourg area.
Wow.
Kind of even verging up into kind of near Belgium. And they're defeated in pretty much short order. And the Prussians then march on Paris. In the meanwhile, Paris descends into sort of another riot because, of course, the French emperor is captured in that battle, and so the French government doesn't have a head, and so everyone's scrambling, and you have what is a commune. It's called the Paris Commune is set up. The Prussians roll up outside of Paris, surround it, and basically threaten to bombard it into rubble. And in the palace of Versailles, meanwhile, all the German princelings and kind of dukes and so on of all the German states gather in the Hall of Mirrors. So we're in Versailles, just as a by the by, we're in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. And Bismarck convinces the Prussian king to be acclaimed German emperor. And he uses a couple bribes, but like everyone's in such high spirits, it doesn't really matter. The money greases the skids, but the sentiment was obviously already there. And so in the Hall of Mirrors, and there's actually a very famous painting about this, Wilhelm I is proclaimed the first German emperor of the German Empire, such that all those princelings and stuff submit to the Prussian king. And he is also simultaneously the German emperor. So that is substantially the borders of modern Germany minus Prussia nowadays. Or the borders of modern Germany are that German Empire minus basically Prussia, more or less. And so that's the sort of extent to which the German Empire has at that point. And it also has Alsace-Lorraine, which most people will probably know about.
Okay. Wow. So Versailles for the lose again. Like everything that goes through Versailles is a catastrophe. That's it shouldn't be surprising. If you want symbolic representation, just look at the history of Versailles. Maybe I'll do a video on history of Versailles. Just Versailles, just the whole thing.
It's no wonder
where all the problems emanate from for the world.
But that's why it became that's why it was such a big focal point after that. Before that, it's also significant as well. Don't get me wrong, but after that, yeah, exactly. That's why it always happened. Treaty of Versailles, all of these sorts of things.
So I just want to talk a little bit here, just because it is important. Like a lot of people maybe won't see it, but it's super important. So I was doing some research about all of this, and you got to keep in mind too. When I was younger, I read a lot of history, so I knew Bismarck, and Bismarck created the modern world. Like I thought he was great. Look at all this, he's structured the school systems, and he, ordered the world, and he had these wonderful contracts around countries, right? Which, because you don't know, that's anachronistic, and he's actually building this new thing that didn't exist before. Seems like a good thing, because I grew up in that sort of a thing, even though that has nothing to do with the way the world actually works, which is why we're still not done with the World War yet, guys. 3 is not happening. 3 was always going on because it's just one big war. But you have this idea, but then when you start looking into it, I found 2 different references. These are just the 2 that I remember, where they were saying Germany, and they're referring to times way before 1850, like way before, hundreds of years before. And I was a little curious, right? I'm like, well, but there isn't a Germany. Like that's ridiculous. And they were using the Roman, in other words, Latin names of those regions. Okay. Now, the Latin name from the Romans of the region of, that's called Germania is tiny. And it wasn't one of those names. This happened twice with two different regions. So I'm like, so you're making an appeal to the Latin. The Latin isn't Germania. So we're not actually talking about the Germans at all, because Germany, if you wanted to use that system, because that's what everybody says, oh, it's Caesar. He's the one that named the region. And it's like, well, Caesar named a region, but it's fairly small. I think it's all the way on the western edge of the border, if I remember correctly. I think it's against the Rhine.
Yeah, most of that region around that.
Right. So we're nowhere near Berlin even. Like we're way past. Yeah, we're
Totally.
close to France, right? Yeah. So that's the region that Caesar named, and all the other regions were named. They all had names. All of them had names. And so the fallback for people justifying ever calling any of this Germany before Otto von Bismarck creates it out of whole cloth and hopes and dreams and evil, because there's a lot of that going on. This is all the duchies of the Roman Empire up until Bismarck comes along. And before that, they're named regions with one thing in common: Germanic style languages, but they're actually vastly different languages. And so when you look, if you just look up like High German, it'll talk about High German. Okay, High German is an anomaly in terms of description. In other words, it looks to me a lot like somebody invented this after the fact, and there was no such thing, because the dialects were so different. Because the whole purpose of saying, you've got the high version of this language and the low version of this language is that the root language is the same, but the dialects are so different that they have a hard time communicating. Okay. But when you look at the description of High German, they wouldn't have been able to talk together either, right? Just because you call it High German doesn't mean those people would have the same words for the same things, which is the case. You can just look that up. So the justification that people use for saying, no, Germany, because they spoke the same language, is nonsense. It's a complete psyop. The idea of Germany, wholesale, modern Germany, ancient Germany, anywhere in between Germany, anything called Germany, is actually a psyop. It is a psyop where people have literally or actually retconned history. They sit there and they write articles about regions that aren't called Germania that they claim are German. And it's like, okay, well, they became eventually, but that makes it anachronistic, part of Germany. But they weren't a part of a thing back then. In fact, they had their own culture and usually their own almost unique language, right? All cultures have trade languages that are separate from the ruling languages, that are separate from the peasant languages. Sorry, just the way it is. It couldn't really happen any other way, so it sort of makes sense. And you can argue English doesn't have that, and I'm like, go to the ghetto, my friend. You tell me if you can. This is a meme at this point, right? And then if you listen to people, and America has the least differentiation for sure by far. We're also one of the newer places. Germany being slightly newer. That's about it. That's what you got. So I understand the confusion growing up now, but just historically, when you look, right, there's always three languages in the region, and one is usually from, or two of one is from the rulers, one is from the traders, and one is for the commoners that are very. That's usually a very local language. That's regional, because that's a national language. Effectively, it's a national language, and so that gets consolidated as empires grow and get bigger. But Germany is a psyop. Modern Germany also should not exist. There's a problem here. Those people don't. There's a famous thing about, you great mustachio man appeals to these these fair-haired, blue-eyed people, and all the people in his army are dark-haired, short, little chunky. Yeah, that's because he's making it up. Why is he making it up? Why can he even get away with that? Because they don't have a history, because they're not a people. They're not a nation. There's several nations maybe, but they're not a nation. And so this unification process begins with Bismarck. And he does it through this over-ordering, I'll call it, right? Or tyrannical, because he is a tyrant, effectively. We'll get into that later. It's a tyrannical ordering of this place that he invents out of whole cloth by drawing lines on a map and giving it a name, right? And just improper naming. So yeah, it's a good stopping point just to point this out. This is my main bugaboo. The whole concept of, I'm sorry, Germans, also, not sorry, you're not a nation. This is a problem. It's still a problem. And this explains the Great War. Like all of this lead up, right? Like, oh no, it's been a constant Great War in the vacuum of the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah, it has. That is the correct way to look at it. And once you see that, and you look, it's the Pope's fault. That might be a fair critique, man. After what they did to the Templars, though, not these other things that people point to, but what they did to the Templars, that seems to be the major spark that causes this whole thing. I don't think any of it happens if Friday the 13th and Jacques de Molay and all that doesn't happen. I could be wrong about that, but my goodness, guys, look at the facts, look at the evidence, look at what happened, look at how things unfolded, look at the pattern, because that's really what this is about. This isn't a new pattern, right? It's a continuation of the Napoleonic pattern. Of this destruction that is a continuation of France basically disintegrating and in a way splitting with Rome. There was always contention. At one time there were two popes or three, but two nominally at least, one in France and one in Rome. So once you see this as a pattern at that scale, and there's other little patterns, but that's the scale of the pattern I want to demonstrate. This is why there's an opening for the Protestant Reformation. This is why all these problems happen, is because of this splintering within the empire of Christendom, within the Christendom structure, if you will. And it's way more lenient than what comes after it. Because what comes after it causes contracts and treaties and Great War. And before this period, actually, and I did once ask the AI, I have a document about this, war is everywhere, and it's much worse. They're less frequent, but they're larger wars with more people killed. That's post-Reformation. So that's just a side effect of the cracking of Christendom into pieces. So, all right, Adam, let's continue from there. What you got?
Yeah, so we left off with the proclamation of the German Empire, and I guess now we can really talk about, because now we actually have a Germany, a German state. Now we can talk about Bismarck's internal policy to reshape everything internally, right? Because let's go back to the start again and just think about where we came from. We come from the Holy Roman Empire, and you have all of these nominally independent states. Some of these places have their own currency, they have their own tariffs and taxes. Okay, some of these are like as small as Monaco. These states are that small. You can get that small, or the size of even a town, which Monaco is a town. Think about the micro states in Europe, and there's like couple hundred of them in the Holy Roman Empire, in addition to other bigger ones. But so you can imagine trade and other things like that can end up being a bit of a sort of a nightmare in terms of if you have to change currency and all this sort of thing. And you can imagine to the Napoleonic mind that's just waiting to be rationalized, and that's exactly what Bismarck ended up trying to do. I mean, this was also done to some degree within the German Federation in the lead up to it, right? Because you still have that same strain of thought which comes from the Napoleonic era that, you know, offered the Prussian king the crown and stuff like that. So there was some overarching framework, but without the head, i.e., without the emperor, and there was nothing to really send all of that home and make sure that it was resolved properly. So we get to the point where we're at this German Empire, and now Bismarck is going to actually set about framing the entire state or country that this is happening in. And he is inheriting a state which is neither Catholic nor Protestant fully. The Prussian king is a Protestant, but in the south of Germany, you have a massive proportion of Catholics. The Reformation, the Holy Roman Empire, all of that was predicated on, after the Peace of Westphalia, the cuius regnum eius religio, i.e., whoever prince you're under, that's the religion you'll follow effectively, and he's perfectly at liberty to enshrine Catholicism or whatever sort of flavor of Protestantism you want to instantiate. And when we get to this point, Bismarck is serving a Protestant king. The Prussians are Lutherans. The Prussian king is Lutheran. Bismarck himself is a Lutheran, and he's a particular sort of Lutheran. He's what's called a pietist, which is basically a form of Lutheranism that it's not exactly right to say it's more fundamentalist, but it is very Protestant. It is not the sort of Protestant that would overlook the Catholic Church and not go about calling the Pope, for instance, the Antichrist. And so when Bismarck inherits the German state, he's achieved his goal of creating the German state, but then now what is it going to look like? And this is the origin of the phrase, because there's two, the way Bismarck sees it, there's two cultures in Germany. There's the Protestant culture and the Catholic culture. And he wants to set about creating a common German culture, which is effectively Protestant. And so this is where we have the origin of the term culture war, Kulturkampf, culture struggle. You know, there's a couple of ways camp can be translated. But effectively, this is a series of policies that Bismarck instantiates to maybe not suppress, but to lessen the power of the Catholic Church within the bounds of the German Empire. One of the things that he does, although not everything is effective, one of the things that he does, and is still a layover in Germany to this day, is the instantiation of a tax, or rather registration for tax on the basis of religion. I.e., if you are a Lutheran, you register on the German state tax roll for Lutheran, and that there's a certain amount of tax that you pay that will go directly to the Lutheran Church, and then they'll distribute it how they want to. Now, that works for Protestant churches which are organized on a national or, somewhat national basis. But for the Catholic Church, what that means is that the Catholic bishops, who, according to Catholic doctrine and Catholic teaching, should owe their loyalty ultimately to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, but are being paid now by the German state in the name of German Catholics, because they, of course, have to register for taxation. And that is still the case even now today in Germany. That's an example. It's not exhaustive, but that is an example of one of the policies that Bismarck implemented that remained until this day. And then there were other broader social policies, not directly related to the Kulturkampf, which would be social welfare and all of these sorts of policies, sick leave and stuff like that, which he himself effectively planned and masterminded to be implemented. And of course, because he occupied a place in the German state where, yes, effectively he was a sort of tyrant or a dictator, in the sense that he occupied all the positions in the Prussian state. He was Chancellor, I believe. Minister president. I think minister president, and then in Germany he was Chancellor. Right. So he had basically and in Prussia, as long as he had the confidence of the king, he could get any law passed. That's effectively how it worked. And so in Germany, because he was the Chancellor, again, he has the confidence of the Emperor. He can also get stuff passed, but because he also architected the state, he made sure that he had his sort of people where he wanted them, in the Reichstag. So that's a kind of brief overview of the culture, the origin of the term culture war, but also the culture war, the historical culture war in Germany.
Right. So then I think it's fair to understand that when people will say nowadays, in quote recent times, use that term, they are correctly, if unknowingly, right? This actually is really important, referring to a war of religion. That's what they're referring to.
Yes.
Because culture comes from religion. I'm sorry, it just does. We can whine about the fact that Zwingli and Calvin have redefined religion, back then, and now we're suffering through this ridiculous way of speaking, because it is a ridiculous way of speaking. Of course, your culture comes from your moral beliefs. Like, where else could culture actually, like, think about it for half a second? Of course, that's where quote culture comes from, and that is the thing that informs your laws. They're not informed from below, and it's not exactly the tablets, although the tablets are helpful. And I think, yeah, he's certainly in this culture war, quote political conflict. I don't believe it's culture war. It's almost an exact translation, is my understanding. It's this culture war. He's disbanding the bureau in the Prussian ministry, right? That like represents the Catholics. He's making it so priests can't give political opinions, right? These are only the Catholic priests, right? He's barring religious teaching from state schools. Does that sound familiar to anyone? So this is all happening, back in like the 1870s, early 1870s. And he's, he tries to get rid of the Jesuits. Like, what? You can't get rid of the Jesuits. They
That's a
won't go.
classic.
Yeah. First sign of a problem. Not that the Jesuits don't need their little comeuppance every once in a while, but yeah, and he establishes a civil marriage. So, like,
Yes.
which, this is like, what is this nonsense, right? So he's at one point he's separating the church from the culture, which is impossible, as I just outlined. Of course, he has to go with Protestantism, because if you want to change something, Catholic orthodoxy is not the way to go. They ain't changing. That ship's too big. It's too much momentum. It's not. Changing that is, a 200-300 year process. So you better make sure you get those changes right, guys. And the whole idea of state oversight of schools, it's all this movement, because he's trying to wrest away the cultural, or the quote inculturation from the Catholics, to de-Catholicize the Catholic regions of this new thing called Germany.
Yeah, but he's also trying to create a common German culture, in his view, because you have this new state of Germany. Now you need something to bind everyone together. Like, it's not exactly the same, but it's reminiscent of actually something Singapore, which is a kind of multi-ethnic state that, if you talk to people from Singapore, they say, I'm a Singaporean. There might be ethnically Malay or whatever. There's an analogous thing happening in Germany, where everyone's a German, but actually among Germans, especially even nowadays, if you talk to them, they're very aware of their own internal divisions. And that is significant, because that's what Bismarck was trying to basically bind people together. And part of the reason why he went against the Catholic Church, although also just being kind of minded towards serving the Prussian king, who was a Protestant, is that the Catholic Church, like it would be later for Stalin and Lenin and so on, posed an existential threat to this new German culture, because Bismarck needed to be sure that the people on the ground were loyal to the Prussian state, and by proxy the Prussian king, who was also the German emperor now. So it makes sense why he implements these policies. And you can see as well in those policies, for instance, the removal of effectively religious teaching from state schools, how this would also appeal to certain people on, again, I'm going to use the French revolutionary terminology because we're in the world of French revolutionary time. On the left, these people who want to redistribute wealth and they want to effectively extirpate religion from the society. Again, the origin in the French Revolution is that they're again the same sort of thing. The left of the French Revolution, the original left, were the people who would force the priests to declare an oath, basically to be loyal to the French state above that of the Pope. And of course, that led to some people refusing that, and eventually some priests and clergy refusing that and being killed for it. Now, of course, at this time, Bismarck has to be a little bit more savvy, and he also he's not from the left as such, right? He's something different. I mean, this shows itself in later political terminology, because you have this left and right, and then you have this talk of a third position later on, which is something that the Nationalist Socialist Party marketed itself effectively as. And that's a digression, but it's just an interesting digression, because you do have this. We are kind of touching on that Bismarck he's a political figure, but he doesn't fit, I don't think, neatly into those frames of the French Revolution, because he's effectively he's doing what he does best, which is to utilize the situation to his own advantage and ends, which is effectively to aggrandize the Prussian, from the beginning was to aggrandize the Prussian king. But of course, by the end of it all, or towards the end of it all, he has the German Empire and he's running the German Empire. Now, this does change later on when he gets older, and the problem that Germany faces when Bismarck dies is who succeeds Bismarck, because at the end of the day, it wasn't Wilhelm I who was running the empire. It was Bismarck using Wilhelm I's consent to get things passed, to change laws, change everything effectively. So this transitionary period, the high point you can think of for Bismarck is the 1870s. He achieves the creation of the German Empire. He executes policies towards forming a German national identity, to create a German national identity, or to create something where people could be comfortable calling themselves German and have something to refer to. And ultimately, culturally, in the culture war, you could say Bismarck wasn't directly successful, because the largest party in Germany up until basically the election, or one of the largest parties in Germany up until the election of the Nationalist Socialists in the late 1930s, was called the Centre Party. And that's not very descriptive. Actually, that's a Catholic party. It's the Catholic Party. It was founded by a particular man. It's kind of doesn't really necessarily bear on talking on him, but to the point of, in Bismarck's paradigm, he effectively failed to win that culture war ultimately, because the Catholics ended up organizing as their own political party, and they were the biggest political party just before and again, just referring back to what the World War II and stuff. They were the biggest single party at the time before the Nationalist Socialists took the Reichstag and everything that happened after then. But they were so it's Bismarck's legacy in Germany stretches far, and it's not that he achieved everything that he set out to do, which is important to say, because although he is kind of the first man to really create this thing of politics, a medieval or even an ancient conception of the sorts of things he was gesturing towards was understood to be something that wasn't purely under the sort of control of science or experimental science, tweaking inputs and getting specified outputs. And that's part of that's important for people to understand when it comes to Bismarck, because he was a man who kept his options open. And so post hoc, it looked like he had a very detailed and almost deterministic plan that only could have ended up the way it ended up, but stuff, little things like that, like the formation of the Centre Party, is actually a failure of his Kulturkampf, and not a success necessarily.
Right. And then the perfection of the image of what he did is Hitler. I mean,
Yes,
explicitly, like
yeah,
there's no question about it. And it's worth noting. So, right. So he's a minister in relation to the king, but he's the Chancellor of Germany. And then who becomes Chancellor of Germany later on? Hitler. And that is not through the process, this loophole process that right. So if you look at business, it's like, wait a minute, the Prussians use a loophole to get kingship. Basically, there's no Prussian king before, right? So they use a loophole to get kingship. They kind of steal it from Poland to some extent, right? And then Bismarck uses a loophole to create to be fair, a political entity which never existed before anywhere. Like this is brandy new in the 1870s, 1850s, that area, to become this thing called Chancellor, right? Which is a type of minister under a king, right? But then that gets separated from kingship. It gets separated from ministerial duties, but it's doing the ministering for sure, which is interesting. The government style ministering, although there's other types of ministering that might be relevant here too, right? And this is all horrifically important because what Hitler does is he uses the new quote technology of quote democracy, which the Greeks told us, don't do that, you dumbasses, it's a bad idea. And this is why, and these are the experiments we did, and this is why they failed and how they failed reliably, right? And so what happens is a good rhetorician comes along and uses a bunch of advanced techniques and forms, the perfection of Bismarck's or his perception of Bismarck's ideal. That's what happened. If you think something else happened, you're wrong. You're just flat out wrong. I hate to say it. But you just look at the progression of the history from 1850 on, and you'll see what's going on. It's not that hard. You just need the broad brushstrokes. You don't need to get into the details, because to your earlier point there, the details will lead you astray. Because you can always go, well, if this detail hadn't worked out that way, then this would have happened instead. And it's like, no, that's not true. Optionality doesn't work the way you think it does. And just because one thing doesn't happen doesn't mean a certain different thing would happen. It could mean any number of other things that would happen, and those things may not have the negative impact on the outcome that you think they would, right? Because you're too tightly tying, like, well, his inability to put the Catholics down effectively did not prevent Hitler. It may have been the strongest voice against Hitler, but it did not prevent Hitler at all. And so, it should have. When one would have hoped that would have done the trick, actually, but it didn't. And so that's just one example of many of how these, just because this one thing is the thing you place as the pivot point, doesn't mean it was as much of a pivot point as you think. And the alternative might not have led you to any. This is the whole argument over, well, had you killed Hitler in the beer halls during the beer push, somebody else would have come in and done the same sort of thing, which is almost certainly the case, by the way, like almost 100% true. There were a lot of people in that party waiting to take over. And you'll notice also it's the National Socialist Party, which, by the way, makes no sense. And I think the reason why people hate nationalism now is because they want socialism to be redeemed. I think that's the easiest way to think of it. You can call me crazy, but also it's really weird. Nationalism is a good thing. You should be part of a nation. The United States is not a nation, but you should be part of the nation that you're from. If you're Irish, you should be proud Irish, even if they can't, for some reason, govern themselves, which is a mystery to this day. Poor Irish people. I feel for the Irish. I really do. I have Irish heritage on my grandpa's side too. I just found out. I'm like, wait, what? I thought it was just my mother's mother, but no, it's my mother's father. They're the Maguires. I was like, wait a minute. I thought the Maguires for sure were my mother's mother, but apparently not. So there's more hunting to do there. So yes, I'm very aggrieved by the Irish condition. Let's make no mistakes, especially for my good friend Adam here, who's being so helpful to to the channel for sure, and generous with his time. So yeah, what do I had to add all that in. I think that was the right point. So what do you want to add, or where do you want to go from here?
Well, I think we should round out Bismarck's life, because this is the Bismarck live stream. There's a lot of stuff we can go into, maybe in other videos as well. You know, the whole how they got the title, or how the Prussian king became the Prussian king, and he's the king of Prussia, but he started off as the king in Prussia. And yeah, there was a bit of aggro with the Polish the Kingdom of Poland at the time. So there's interesting kind of tidbits, but actually the broad brush strokes, I think we should probably just finish with Bismarck's death, and then what sort of a brief kind of gesture to what happens afterwards, because Bismarck lives a long time, but his role was effectively dependent upon the king being receptive and willing to retain him as minister president and chancellor. And that's, of course, worked with his friend William I, or Wilhelm I. But Wilhelm I's son, who we all know as the Kaiser Wilhelm of, World War I, he wanted to take things in a different direction. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to the sort of man he was, and whether he had resentment towards his grandmother, who was Queen Victoria, and then maybe that's why he got into the war with them and stuff like that. But suffice it to say is that when Wilhelm I died, there was a small interlude where there was his son, pardon me, his grandson is Wilhelm II, the one we all know, and then his son, Wilhelm II's father, was basically Kaiser for about 5 years, and nothing much happened there because he was rather sick during the entire period. And so anyways, Wilhelm II takes the throne, and he dismisses Bismarck as chancellor and minister president. And some of the reasons that are given for that are potentially that he saw his dad, or his grandfather, be basically advised and kind of corralled by Bismarck into doing what Bismarck wanted. And for a royal prince, that probably rubbed him the wrong way, because, of course, so far as he was being told, he was in charge and he would be the one who'd be calling the shots. So eventually, after Wilhelm II became emperor, a couple of years afterwards, basically, and he got enough of his men in positions, he gave Bismarck the boot, and Bismarck actually died, not being chancellor anymore. He died effectively having been exiled from court,
Yeah.
So Bismarck ends his life actually in sort of obscurity, but Wilhelm basically takes things in a different direction, and ultimately the plans that Bismarck had laid out diplomatically as to where this new German state should be, who it should be allied with. So, for instance, just looking forward to World War I and what we might know about that, and what we do know, just to recap for anyone who doesn't remember, the alliances that worked, it was a mess of alliances, but the main alliances that were in play in World War I were France and Russia were allied. I believe Britain ended up being allied to France, or at least they got in because Belgium was invaded, but France and Russia were allied. And Germany and Austria-Hungary were allied. And basically, and there were smaller states involved, and we know the whole Serbia and Sarajevo and Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Let's just forget the mess that is, and let's just keep on with those main alliances. Those main alliances basically were a big factor in the war, because Germany is caught between France and Russia. So in that configuration, Germany always has to fight a two-front war.
Yep.
Whereas what Bismarck was trying to do at the time, and people make a big deal about him predicting World War I, and in fact he even said that it would happen because of some silly thing that came out of the Balkans. He said some damn fool thing out of the Balkans will start at whatever the next great war is. And he was right, and I think, credit to him. But what Bismarck was trying to do in just before he was kicked out of being minister, diplomatically speaking, was he was trying to get Germany allied with Russia. And the reason why is, of course, that it would prevent that two-front conflict. And Austria-Hungary didn't really matter what happened there, if they were on good or bad terms. And immediately after being kicked out of being the Chancellor, Wilhelm II pursues a policy which basically would ally him with Austria-Hungary. And part of the reason that was given for this was basically like a nationalist idea of, well, the Austrians it's actually a familiar one if you look forward to what happens later on. The Austrians in the Austria-Hungary should be part of Germany, so we should be on good terms with them. That put them, that strained the relationship that they had with Russia. And so eventually Wilhelm basically was so focused on that he forgot to maintain and keep the Russian state on side. And so the Russians and the French signed the Entente, which is the kind of original allies or whatever, the Entente Cordiale. And that was the major change that ended up worsening Germany's position at the outset of the Great War. And as we know later on in the Great War, Great War Part 2, Germany's position between France and Russia also cost them a lot and ended up losing them the war. They lost twice for largely the same reasons, at least strategically, on just the war front aspect of it. And so ultimately Bismarck's legacy in regards to Germany was fumbled, but the thought that he left behind, the sort of system of thought that he left behind in regards to how a government's supposed to be run, can you create nations? Can you or can you not create nations? I mean, remember at the end of the Great War Part 1, you actually have the creation of all of these other nations, Czechoslovakia, Serbia, well, actually it was Yugoslavia, right, which then ended up being something else. And then it's worth noting as well, Yugoslavia was a monarchy. It was a created monarchy from whole cloth. Austria, Hungary, all of these different, nations, or however you want to describe it.
Middle East. The
entire Middle East. Yeah, in the wake of the Ottoman Empire.
Right, and that's important because all the Middle East stuff goes back to basically after the first act of the Great War and the great betrayal of Britain that has way too much cultural influence at this point. Of the native people, right? Lawrence of Arabia goes in there, makes a bunch of deals. He's the guy. They renege on all their deals, and they get the U.S. to agree because we, for some reason, are the 900-pound gorilla, despite not really participating in the first act very well, and probably causing an actual global pandemic, not a fake one. It's very strange. It's very strange. But the entire Middle East, that map is drawn then. That map, it looks very, very different before that. And it's based on tribalism, on actual tribalism, not the kind of garbage tribalism everyone's using nowadays. And because their tribalism worked, actually. It's when we broke their tribalism that, and you can go back and say, well, they've been at war for 250 years, Mark, and whatever. Yes, they had, but they were tribal wars. And now they're involving, actually the whole world, right? If you want what's going to spark Act 3 of the Great War, yeah, I'm gonna go with the Middle East. I'm not gonna go with Ukraine. Ukraine will be seen as the spark, maybe, but it's the Middle East. It's a particular place in the Middle East that also is part of this experiment this is a dumb experiment. Can't be done this way, guys. It's been tried for thousands of years. It never worked before. It's not going to work this time. So we've got this system that's put in place, right? This country, Germany's built out of whole cloth. Then we've got the collapse of the system, I think, is really what you're describing. And a king in particular is not well suited to understand the new mechanisms that were created by the guy he kicked out, to be a little fair to Bismarck. And now he doesn't understand the dynamics because the world dynamics have already changed, because now people are following the model that was set out by first Napoleon and then Bismarck. And to the extent that it's a success, like there are successes, as in Germany, everybody talks about Germany. They're defending Germany historically by inserting the name in places it doesn't belong, clearly does not belong, right? So we're rousing success. Thanks for destroying the world and psyoping everybody, Bismarck, right? But people are trying to follow that pattern because it is successful in some sense, and they're trying to preserve that pattern because they want that to work. Like, we still want the Middle East to work. Nobody doesn't want the Middle East to work. We just did something that cannot ever work, and that's why there's the problem that we have, right?
Right. And it's, the specific historical context, the legacy of Bismarck, we're really still in it. Yeah, and it's because of, if you think about things politically, you're thinking in the frame of Bismarck, in the sense that he left it over. If you're thinking of great powers, if you're thinking of what happens afterwards, everything that happens afterwards is effectively downstream from Bismarck's political thought. And we are still in that same paradigm where peace has to be the rule, effectively.
Yeah.
And that's that was a lot of what Bismarck was operating out of. And ultimately, specifically for Germany, everything's downstream from Bismarck. But for us today, and later on in history as well, the kind of framework that he leaves behind is the framework that basically we have that we are kind of using. And it is in that kind of, we can build a nation, we can start things from scratch. He leaves that as a kind of bookend. And that's the most significant portion, because if you look back all the way through, from Napoleon to the Middle Ages, all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome, the unique portion of what Bismarck is contributing is this kind of making a nation from whole cloth. Like the world we live in is Bismarck's world.
Yeah.
It's the world of not just diplomacy, but it's internal policy, social engineering. These are all concepts that get their start, realistically speaking, in Bismarck's time.
Right.
The creation of social welfare, the creation of, you name it, Bismarck will have had a hand in these sorts of systems. And yeah, Wilhelm II didn't understand it, but I also think that we kind of don't understand it because we're missing him in that context.
Right. We don't realize that he's the pivot point and the change. And I think that, as much as I hate this framing, it's actually really good framing in this case. We are all NPCs in the video game that basically was created by Otto von Bismarck. And because of his successes, such that they were, we now have a way of talking about politics that is, if you read old literature and you hear references to the word politic, they're not using it at all the way we would use it. It's totally, but politicking is about gaining the favor or disfavor of others in a group or within your class, basically. Also outside of your class in some cases. So this shows, like, if you study Latin, even if you fail it, like I did, failed every single freaking piece of, I don't think I passed a test. But I did all the work. If you actually read this stuff, you'll hear what they're talking about. And if you read later stuff, you'll hear in medieval times what they're talking about. It's the same thing. It's about favor. Maybe you can do politics with the lower class, but you're gaining favor or losing favor with that class. That's what they're referring to. They're not referring to what we're referring to with government or governance and how much control you have, right? And so you can kind of look at what Bismarck did as applying quote modern science to the state, to, right, just burn Plato's Republic. You might as well, because if you're reading Plato's Republic now, you're probably not understanding any of it because of this NPC quality that you have. If you want to sort of dive deeper, there's a whole book club I have on Texas Wisdom Community or if you don't want to dive that deep, and fair enough, that's pretty long. It's two and sometimes 3 episodes per book. We really went deep on that one. I have 3 relevant videos, right, that talk about sort of some of the misconceptions that people still have, because apparently reading old books doesn't work. It certainly doesn't, especially if you don't have the context of Bismarck. You really won't understand that this modern idea, and to some extent, the modern idea of politics in Europe and the way they use the word, and the modern idea of politics in the United States is different, significantly different too. Like, not a little bit, it's actually quite a lot, but they're both different from what medievals would have talked about using that term. And all of these changes are downstream from the video game creator, the Matrix creator, known as Otto von Bismarck. And yeah, he wasn't the first one to try these things or to do these things in some cases, but he was the first one to do them in that way and be successful enough to be copied. Nobody was copying Napoleon. That was the big piece. He says, all right, peace at all costs. The cost is the system. It's a machine. I'm going to build the machine. So if you want to harken back to Kingsnorth's idea of the machine is created by Bismarck. We don't have to cooperate with the machine. It doesn't actually own you. You can get out of it really easily, guys. I assure you, this is still off. It's still off, right? It's not that hard. Like, you can actually opt out, and you can actually operate with it and cooperate with it and make it better at the same time. So yeah, this idea that we're the NPCs in his video game is probably the best way to get sort of the younger generation to understand. No, you are an NPC. This is why you think this way. You're not getting out of it even by destroying the quote myth of World War II. You're not going to escape Bismarck, because he's before all that, right? He is the lead up to the Great War, and he is the reason for the Great War. The Great War is the system tearing itself apart because the system is tyrannical. If you want something that has a chance of not being tyrannical, you actually need a king. We just have this backwards. We just have this wholesale backwards. It's not to say that no kings are ever tyrannical, but also the odds of getting a tyranny with a king go down, not up. The odds of getting a tyranny with a political system of any kind, or a system of governance of any kind, are 100% over time. And it's not a very long time. Now, you can push back and say, but the United States, and I'll be like, yeah, man, I don't get it. Look, how is this done so well for so long? I have theories. I'd love to chat with a bunch of people about them, because I think I could make some progress there. But fine, we'll leave that as the open mystery. But it's outside of this experiment in the United States, it's pretty clear this doesn't work. It becomes tyrannical almost instantaneously for some reason. They saw that in the French Revolution when they tried it without a system, and Bismarck goes, well, all you needed to do was apply a system, and then Napoleon would have been successful, sort of thing. And at least that's the way I see it.
Yeah. Oh, I think as well, in the context of war, what's happens, the change that's happened now, because over time, yes, since the Protestant Reformation, you could say it's become more intense, but what's happening, particularly between the Napoleonic Wars and Bismarck, and what basically is the post-Bismarck world, is you have this system where, at least during the Napoleonic Wars, there's way more people involved. You have conscription. We talked about that in our last video.
Yep.
But by Bismarck's time, you have this world order, or this systemic agreement that we want to limit war as well.
Right.
And so what you have concatenating there, because of course the technology doesn't wait for anyone. It continues as it goes, and it improves. And what you get compounding over time is you get really intense periods of conflict, whereas there's great infrastructural, loss of life, all this sort of damage that happens.
Industrialized war. You get
fully industrialized war.
A machine can only wage an industrial scale war. A machine can't wage a small battle.
Yeah.
It can't do it functionally. That's why
you have
the Middle East.
Yeah, well, that's why you get the Great War and stuff like that. The reason why you might want to describe it as World War One and Two is just because those are the periods of intense conflict. Realistically, you can group it as the one conflict, and that's true. But the kind of the kind of bursts of really intense conflict are about 5 years apiece. That seems to be as long as it can go in this kind of post-Bismarck world. Is like 5 years max of intense, all-out industrialized conflict, because at some point something just has to break. And so in the context of that, back to the kind of like where we are, where we came from, and what Bismarck adds to this is it's a system, it's a sort of tyrannical system, but it's also a system that doesn't do what it seems to say it does, i.e., well, it's operating under the principle of we're trying to limit war, we're trying to maintain the balance of powers, or however you want to frame it, because that would be exactly how it would be framed in a sort of Bismarckian sense. We are dealing with wars that, war is not the same. War now is not the same as it was 1,000 years ago, and it's not just the technology; it's the duration and it's the thinking around it. It's the thinking of, it's the industrialized part of it, but then it's also what's a war for? In 1300, a war might include a couple barons and the peasantry, and we all kind of know each other, and we may have some real grudges about what we did to one another. But by the time you get to Bismarck's time, war is now, and Napoleon as well, because Napoleon contributes the fact that his war is basically for his aggrandizement, as and against everyone else. And then Bismarck uses that, and what if I use it for my aggrandizement, but it's actually really to achieve these things that I want to see in the world, right? The Franco-Prussian War creates the German Empire. He uses that to create a nation or a state, and that's the world we're in. It's just that on repeat.
Right. Well, and it's also, I've read this a million times. Very popular opinion. I think it's accurate. Germany is in a fight for resources through colonization, and they're pissed off because they're like, well, all the great nations, in order to be a great nation, we need to have colonies, because all the great nations had colonies. Now, how true that is and to what extent is a different, right? But like, you just have to look at England and say, how does a little tiny place like have the biggest navy and destroy all the other navies in places that have more resources and things like that? And it's like, well, colonies, that's the actual answer. But the way colonies work, and maybe I'll link one of the mosaic art videos here. How colonies work is very, very different from how you think they work, or at least how England set them up. And they're very, very different from how, say, Germany would run their colonies, just because the world had kind of changed at some level as a result of. So we've never adjusted to the fallout from the French Revolution. Still, so that's really what we're going back to, which is the result of the beheading of the king, right? But that's the pivot point. Like, had the French Revolution not happened, maybe kingship could have been restored. That's up in the air, but maybe, but once you industrialize killing with the guillotine, it's all over. It's all like there's a new world order, like chaos becomes an option. And then the fight back is order. And then, we have an overly tyrannical system, and the solution to an overly tyrannical system, to be fair, is war. It's just, we haven't broken the system. The wars aren't breaking the system because we're not letting them effectively. That's if you need proof of that, just read the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. Just read that, right? And realize, oh no, this directly causes the second act to happen quickly, right? And then you can say, oh, well, the third act, we're fine because it's been so long. It's like, no, that pressure's still building up. That system's still tyrannical. That video game still has the qualities of that video game that need to be fixed. And we're not even close to addressing any of it. The only person talking about this that I know of is me, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's coming for all of us as well, in the sense that some people might look at this and say, well, this Bismarck thing, it's localized in Germany. I'd say take a second look at the map of Europe, and then take a second look at basically anywhere. Look at Africa, okay? The scramble for Africa is is all the major sub-Saharan African countries right now are all as a result of the Congress of Berlin, which was part of the scramble for Africa, where people were just divided in, like, they were just taking colonies. They were saying this is, so modern day Namibia and Tanzania are the old German colonies of German East and Southeast and West Africa, right? And but that happened across, like, all the countries you have in Africa are a result of a Bismarck style of viewing the world. Because of course after the mother countries pull out or leave, then you have this creation of a nation, but in fact it's not a nation, it's a bunch of tribes that are still in the colonial boundaries. And and you may say, well, that's a German thing. Well, what's India? And it's not limited to a German conception of it's not limited to the boundaries of the administrative region of Germany. It extends to India, because India wasn't a country before the British retreated from it.
Right.
And then you can look into, it really extends as far as you can see. All Southeast Asia, what are they like? None of them were
right.
And kind of very ancient states. There might be some exceptions there, but every single one you can think of. And East Asia, whenever you go to the East, it gets real kind of fuzzy and stuff like that. But rest assured, all of these, North and South Korea, all of these sorts of states, they're all operating out of that Bismarck style framework. And like even China, modern day China, like what's happening there? It's an ancient civilization, to be sure, but they aren't silly. They caught up with how the West sort of thinks about things, and they're realizing what it can do for them.
Yeah,
there's basically nowhere where you don't see this sort of thinking being not just implemented, but actually like being like the existence of these countries is a consequence, is an instantiation of that in the world.
Yeah,
that's probably where I'd leave it.
Yeah, that's excellent, Adam. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to sort of highlight, and I'll do more on this. Gerard's mimicry is correct. His mimetic desire is wrong, and his always leads to war is dumb. And he's actually anti-Catholic, but I'll cover that elsewhere. I mean, I've covered it a little bit, but I'll cover it more. Mimicry works at the group level too, at the level of the quote egregore, hyperobject, or whatever nonsense word for spirit you want to substitute because you're a science idiot and you can't talk normal language like a human. Basically, yeah, that copying is still going on. That mimicry of the creation of Germany, where this minister just goes in and creates a sub way of managing or governance, a way of managing a place, and calls it chancellorship, and which is, the idea of a chancellor is totally different from what Bismarck is doing, right? And then he instantiates a government and uses that to rule this place rather than a king, effectively. And he's able to get away with that, to your point, through the unique set of circumstances. And all the copying that's going on since then is copying of that. So it's not just, as we posited in the Frontier of Ideas, echoing the United States, although almost all of Germany is echoing the United States, right? It's also Bismarck particularly, and specifically because of his, quote, success, even though we'll say the ideal success is still the US or something. So yeah, any closing thoughts as we close it out here, sir?
No, I think we've pretty much covered a lot of what we kind of set out to do. I mean, we can do more videos and stuff like that to flesh it out. But I think where we leave off here is kind of where we really kind of were aiming for. I think in all of our history videos was kind of pointing at that. So yeah, I'd say I just leave it at that. Yeah, we're in Bismarck's world, and now what do we do? That's,
now what do we do?
We could have a look at like what happens afterwards in more detail. But realistically speaking, when it comes to framing things, I think that's Bismarck is the last sort of major turning point, and now we're still in that sort of frame. And yeah, I mean, I'd encourage everyone to go read about him. Go read around him, and read what happens afterwards. The stuff we're talking about, the patterns we're talking about, aren't it's not just malarkey. It's really, you'll see it. You'll keep on seeing it, and once you see it, once you keep on seeing it, and the fact that it doesn't really seem to happen before necessarily in the same way, you'll see how much influence Bismarck has, not just in history, but also in the present day and even in your everyday life.
Excellent. Yeah. So, Adam, thank you so much for your time. Adam is recently married. I know because I was at the wedding. It was lovely.
Thank you.
Ireland is a beautiful country, is a beautiful wife, and soon, hopefully, beautiful babies. Many 2-3 million, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, God willing. Yeah.
God willing. Yes. Miracles are real, guys. Don't poo-poo me just because I'm shooting for the moon here. So yeah, I mean, if any of this doesn't make sense, in the comments, right? If you want to hear more, if you want us to do more, in the comments. And if I could ever steal any of his time ever again, because we're in this like unique period, then hopefully he can grace us with his presence. He won't be too busy running around being a good husband and father and single-handedly saving Ireland from itself. And we'll be able to have him on again. And also I'm willing to do, sort of wrap up and round up videos on the patterns. And look, if you like this video and you haven't seen all the other ones, because this is all a set, right? We did this on purpose. We didn't know exactly where it was going to go. But we did this on purpose. We knew what we were doing to some extent. All the research is fresh. It's all done by us. We're not going to cite sources because we don't do that sort of thing, and it's pointless. You can find this stuff yourself, and you should, because then you'll believe us more if you do the work yourself. So look, Adam, thank you so much for your time. Thank your lovely wife for me for allowing me to steal you away.
Absolutely, no problem. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you all for your time and attention. If you found this helpful, like, subscribe, tell your friends, threaten your enemies, make everybody watch. Really appreciate it. And look, watch them all and ask the questions if you have them. Thank you so much.